Here we go. Nehemiah, the cupbearer. I said last time we were together that Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king. The king that Nehemiah serves here in this story is Artaxerxes. That's his name, Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes, just another fun fact, is the son of Xerxes, who we also know as Ahasuerus. His father was the king that married Queen Vashti. That had Queen Vashti expelled from the throne so that he could then find a new wife in the lady Esther, the Jewish lady Esther. But this is Artaxerxes. He's a Persian, and Nehemiah bears his cup for him. That means that Nehemiah is a greatly respected person to the king. Like we said last time, again, the last person that will drink the liquid out of that cup before the king tastes it is the cupbearer, to make sure there's no poison, that nobody's trying to assassinate the king, kill the king. So Nehemiah was a greatly respected person. The promise that we're looking for here is a little different promise. Nehemiah prays to God for something. So more than God making a promise, what we're looking at, I bent it a little bit for this book. What we're looking at is to see whether God answers this prayer and just how God takes care of his city, Jerusalem. In Nehemiah 1 verse 11, this is what Nehemiah prays: "O Lord, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight to revere your name." He's talking about his fellow Jews, the remnant who are worshipers of Yahweh, who serve Yahweh. He's praying not only for himself, but on behalf of his nation, Israel. He says, make your servant successful today. What we're looking at is how successful God made Nehemiah, because by this prayer, there's almost a promise in it. That's why it's been recorded. Will God do this for Nehemiah? And what are the odds? What's Nehemiah up against? Who's King Artaxerxes? And why is this a difficulty for God? A difficulty, almost in quotes, definitely a difficulty for Nehemiah, as I'll show you tonight. Make your servant successful today and grant him compassion before this man. There's something about Artaxerxes that we have to know and realize. Why is it that Nehemiah is so nervous about this? What is it about Artaxerxes that Nehemiah has trouble with? He calls him this man, and then at the very last phrase he says, "Now I was a cupbearer to the king." And we saw last time that this is King Artaxerxes. On the timeline again, quickly, I just want to show you again where we are. Some important dates. In 586 BC, that's when the southern kingdom of Judah falls to the Babylonians. Israel is no longer in the land. Israel is being disciplined for their idolatry. God kicks them out. The last of the Jews are kicked out of Israel by God himself in 586 BC. The next thing on the chart in 538, 50 years later, we have Cyrus, another Persian. Cyrus, the king of Persia, he issues a decree that the Jews can now begin returning to the land. You can go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So in 538, Cyrus says, go back and rebuild the temple. The Jewish leader who goes back to Jerusalem is a man named Zerubbabel, who is a son of David. I don't mean son as in direct son like Caleb is my son, one generation apart. He is in the line of King David. He is royal blood. Zerubbabel is. The king goes back to Jerusalem. The seed of the king in Zerubbabel goes back to Jerusalem to start rebuilding the temple. In 515 BC, the temple is restored. They have rebuilt what the Babylonians destroyed. 70 and a half years after 586, the temple is restored. Jewish worship of Yahweh can continue. The book of Ezra covers this time period. Ezra doesn't get involved until later, but he writes about these things. The temple being restored. It wasn't until 458 BC that Ezra returns to Jerusalem. I'll tell you more about why Ezra went back to Jerusalem in a little bit. And then in 450 BC, that's when Ezra's writing, that's the time that his writing no longer covers. In 450, Ezra's history of Israel stops. And then we have after that in 444 BC, I'm telling you, if you know any numbers about Jewish history, know these. Know that in 931 BC, Israel split. That is a huge number. You got to know it. In 931 BC, Israel went from being one people, 12 united tribes, to splitting in half. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes that were in the north, they went out of the land to Assyria. The Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom in 722. The next major event that occurs is what's first on the list here. In 586 BC, the rest of the Jews, the two kingdoms, the two tribes that are left in the south, they go out, not to Assyria, but under the Babylonians. They are destroyed and taken away from Israel and into Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. Those are major dates. The other major date in Israel is 444 BC. It's critical as Christians that we know this date because we date Jesus Christ the Messiah off of this year. In Daniel chapter 9, his prophecy about the future of Israel being 70 weeks, 490 years, we have to know when that 490 year clock begins. And this is when it begins. In 444 BC, Nehemiah, not Zerubbabel, not Ezra, but finally in 444 BC, look how many years have gone by. Almost 100 years have passed since Zerubbabel first went back into the land to rebuild the temple. Almost 100 years have gone by. So I just want you to make sense of these numbers and be able to see, oh yeah, that's almost 100 years. Finally, Nehemiah returns to the land and he is sent back by Artaxerxes to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, to rebuild the walls, the city gates, to make Jerusalem safe from its enemies. He goes back to rebuild the city itself almost 100 years after Cyrus told Zerubbabel, go back and rebuild the temple. So the writing of the book of Nehemiah begins with this event in 444 BC, his conversation with the one who he calls this man. Father, I need you to give me success with this man. And there's a reason why it's almost a derogatory phrase that this man has been good and bad, as I'll show you in a minute. Nehemiah ends, he only covers 12 years of history. The writing of the book of Nehemiah only covers 12 years of history. It ends in 432 BC. At least the history that it covers ends there. So there's the timeline that we are. Look at the scriptures. Let's see what it says. In Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Kislev in the 20th year when I was in Susa, the capital. He gives a lot of information in that first verse. What year is it? The 20th year of King Artaxerxes. What year is it? Look at the timeline. What year is it when Nehemiah begins to write? It's 444 BC. This event occurs in 444 BC. Just to show you, he says that he was in the capital Susa. Shushan, you may read it also called Shushan in other places, but here it is way over here. Now I'm going to have a little star come up so you can see where Susa is. And now I'm going to draw Jerusalem for you. You got 900-mile distance between the capital where Nehemiah is speaking to King Artaxerxes, where he's serving him as his cupbearer in the capital, 900 miles away from the little bitty nation of Israel, the land of Canaan, Jerusalem being in the southern part of the land down here. 900-mile difference. I just want you to see on the map the distinctions and why Nehemiah doesn't know what's going on in Jerusalem unless people come, make that 900-mile trip to Susa and say, this is what's going on. We live in an age now to where you pick this thing up and you say, what is going on in Tiananmen Square, China? And you can probably find a live camera showing you just exactly what's going on there. It wasn't like that then. You got to transport your mind to a time when these things weren't possible. Nehemiah doesn't know what's going on in Jerusalem and in Judah until these people come. And in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, in 444 BC, his brother and some other men come. In verse 2 it says, while I was in Susa, the capital, that Hanani, my brother, one of my brothers, biological brother, and some men from Judah came. They made the 900-mile, 4-month-long trip. And they had news. It says, I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had been able to go back to Jerusalem. I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity. And I asked them about Jerusalem. He wanted to know about his countrymen. He wanted to know about God's holy city, Jerusalem, where the temple was. In verse 3, here's the news that Nehemiah heard about Jerusalem from his brothers and his friends. Listen to what it says in verse 3. They said to me, what's his question? How are the Jews? How's Jerusalem? I know that the temple has been restored. I know these certain things about what's going on. Remember, he's a high official in the court. And this is what they said to him. The remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach. You want to know about the people? They are in a state of dishonor and disgrace. Reproach is a Hebrew word that means dishonor, a state of dishonor and disgrace. The people are greatly distressed. Why? Why would they be distressed? The temple stands. We need to talk more about that as we keep unveiling this story. So he describes what's happening with the people, and then he describes what's happening with the city. And the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and gates are burned with fire. Without walls, Jerusalem simply wasn't safe from our enemies. In that day, that's why all these cities were walled. That's why Jericho had this wall, and the Jews thought this is impenetrable. There's no way we can, Joshua, there's no way we can take this city with their implements that they had as wanderers in the wilderness, except God made the walls of Jericho fall down at the sound of the trumpets and the shout of the people. God can do it. But that's why these cities all had walls. They needed the walls for protection. Jerusalem was not safe. It was unprotected. So what happened in Jerusalem? What was happening there? The temple, remember the timeline, the temple had already been rebuilt. Ezra the priest, who was in line of Aaron the high priest, the king Zerubbabel, the seed of the king was back in the land. The seed of the high priest was back in the land in Ezra because he was a child of Aaron. Ezra has already gone back. He was sent back to spiritually revitalize Israel. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Ezra was sent back not to rebuild the temple. Look at this timeline again. It's a very important point. Sometimes you'll hear a pastor say, or somebody that teaches the Bible, Ezra is all about the rebuilding of the temple, and Nehemiah is all about the rebuilding of the city. Is that true or false? It's true and false. The book of Ezra is about the rebuilding of the temple, but Ezra had no part in that. Ezra physically, the man named Ezra, had no part in that. By the time Ezra got to Jerusalem in 458 BC, the temple had been standing for 65 or 70 years. Ezra was sent back into the land because the people, the Jews that went back into the land, they were intermarrying with the pagans again. The priesthood was in shambles. The temple worship was in shambles. And Ezra was sent back with all the cups and all the utensils and all the silverware and everything. Artaxerxes sent Ezra back to restore and rebuild the people. The people. Revitalize these people so that they will worship their God again, so that they can pray to their God that I will be protected, me, the king, and his sons. That's what you read when you read through this book. You go back and revitalize the people. I'll show you that in a slide in a second. So the temple's up. Ezra's in the land to revitalize the people. This is Ezra who taught the people the law for all day. One day he read from the law. Can you imagine that? An all-day Bible service. That was the great Ezra. But someone, who do you think that someone is? Somebody guess in a second. Someone stopped the rebuilding of the city. The temple was up. It didn't need to be rebuilt. It had already been rebuilt. But in this time period right here, someone had stopped the rebuilding of the city. They'd stopped the rebuilding of the walls, and they'd stopped the rebuilding of the gates. I mean, they'd been there for 70 years. Surely there were Jews that were trying to rebuild the city itself, the structure of the city, the fortress beside the temple, the walls of the city, the gates. They had gotten permission from a certain king of Persia to do that, and then a certain king of Persia said, no more, stop. And then there was another king of Persia that said again, okay, continue. I'm sending Nehemiah back as the governor of Judah to rebuild the wall. You know who that man was? It was this man, Artaxerxes. He did all of it. He did all three of those things I just described. Artaxerxes said, go back and rebuild the wall. A few years later, Artaxerxes was met by some men that said, this is a very bad idea, king. Let me tell you about these people, this city, Jerusalem, how destructive, how rebellious they are. And they got into Artaxerxes' head. He went and did some research. I'll show you the verses in a second. He said, stop. And now Nehemiah is the cupbearer to this king. And now Nehemiah gets news from his brother and his brother's traveling companions that the city walls and the gates of Jerusalem are in disrepair. The people are in disgrace. They're unsafe. And Nehemiah has on his plate, how God am I going to go to this king and tell this particular king, this man, rebuild the city of Jerusalem, when only 2 years earlier this man, this king Artaxerxes said, stop. It's like Moses. It's like Yahweh sending Moses into Pharaoh and saying, let my people go. God, you can't send me. There's no way I can pull that off. And here you have Nehemiah. Then you start to understand when the king asks him, tell me, what would you like done? And the very first thing the scripture says that Nehemiah did was that he prayed to God, because he knew, God, this is a work of God, because no one can change this king's mind. He just decreed that the city stop being built. And now I've got to go back and tell him the reason I'm sad is because this particular city is broken down. Look what the scripture says in Ezra 4:11. Now, I go back to Ezra because in the book of Ezra, which happened before, but in the book of Ezra in chapter 4, from verse 6 all the way to verse 23, Ezra is talking about how hard it was for the temple to get rebuilt because Satan had his men on the ground trying to stop the rebuilding of the temple. While Ezra is telling the story of how difficult it was for the men who came before him, Zerubbabel and others, to rebuild the temple, Ezra says it's just like what happened later in the time of Nehemiah when they were trying to rebuild the walls. There was a king that made them stop. So in Ezra chapter 4, 6 to 23, there's this parentheses, there's this story that he brings in to show people have always been against Jerusalem. They were against the rebuilding of the temple. Now, in the future, they'll be against the rebuilding of the wall. It shows you that Ezra wrote later of events that happened. But this is what it says in Ezra. I said all that so you could go back, and if your timeline is messing you up in the head, know that in Ezra 4, he's speaking of Nehemiah's day, which came later. And this is what he says happened in Nehemiah's day. It says, to King Artaxerxes, this is the king that Nehemiah bears the cup for. To King Artaxerxes, your servants, the men in the region beyond the river. This is not a good letter. This is from people that hate the Jews. And they're trying to pressure Artaxerxes to stop rebuilding this city. Don't let this happen. To King Artaxerxes, your servants, the men in the region beyond the river. And now let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem. 900-mile difference here. They are rebuilding the rebellious city and evil city and are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. That they want stopped. These Jews are rebuilding this rebellious and evil city. They are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. The very next verse says this, now let it be known to the king that if that city is rebuilt and the walls are finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and it will damage the revenue of the kings. What's this about? Hatred of the Jew. Satan's never asleep when it comes to destroying the Jew. He doesn't want the city of Jerusalem rebuilt. And the way they bait the king is, king, if you let this city get rebuilt, you will not get the money that you're currently getting. They will fortify themselves. They will become strong behind their wall. They will rebel against you, and they will stop sending the cash. And the Jews are good at making money. So I can imagine that this was a pretty decent area to gather tax revenue from. Later in that same, just 6 verses later in Ezra 4:19, they get into Artaxerxes' head. And this is what happens. In 4:19 it says, a decree has been issued by me and a search has been made. This is Artaxerxes. It has been discovered in the records, in the city's records, the records that the kingdom, the Persian Empire, the records that they keep, King Artaxerxes went and searched. You say this Jerusalem is a rebellious city, I'm going to find out for myself. So he says a search has been made. It has been discovered that that city has risen up against the kings in past days. I could tell you a couple of places where that happened, but one in particular, when not Hezekiah, Zedekiah, I think, was the last king of the southern tribes of Judah in the south. I believe his name was Zedekiah. He rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar went to Babylon to get Jews out in 605 BC. He went again in 597 BC. And finally in 586 BC, because Jerusalem and King Zedekiah had rebelled against him, he squashed it for good. I'm not going to put up with this anymore. And he destroyed the city of Jerusalem. That was a rebellious act against the king Nebuchadnezzar. So these records they have. It has been discovered that that city, Jerusalem, has risen up against kings in the past, that rebellion and revolt have been perpetrated in it. that mighty kings have ruled over Jerusalem, governing all the provinces beyond the river, and that tribute, custom, and toll were paid to them. So if Jerusalem raises up in power, in the history books we have seen that David, Solomon, these great kings had money coming into them, that foreign Gentile nations were paying Israel. And you are right. If I let this city be built and let these walls be established and give strength back to the Jews, they might yet again raise up and have a mighty king who gathers the money for himself. You see the problem? The very next verse. So what am I going to do about it? King, you've got all the power in the world. You are the king of the empire. What are you going to do about it? So now issue a decree to make these men stop work, that this city may not be rebuilt until I say so, until a decree is issued by me. And you jump into the book of Nehemiah, and you see Nehemiah in his head knowing these words. That Artaxerxes said Jerusalem will not be rebuilt by anyone's authority unless I say it. Stop the building of this city. And now Nehemiah all of a sudden has this information from his brother Hanani and the friends that Jerusalem is not doing well, and the walls and the gates are torn down and burned. Nehemiah has this burning in his soul for God's city Jerusalem, and he's got a real issue on his hands. Am I bold enough to bring this up to the king who just 2 years ago made a decree to stop rebuilding it? How do I do this? If these men are against Jerusalem, if the records show that Jerusalem has been a rebellious city, who am I, God, to go before this king and plead the case for your city, Jerusalem? I'm incapable of that. But what a man we see in Nehemiah. A couple verses later, this is what you see. It says, then as soon as the copy of King Artaxerxes' document was read before Rehum and Shimshai, the scribe, and their colleagues, these were the people saying Jerusalem is bad. As soon as Artaxerxes' document was read by them, the king says, stop the building. They took off. They went in haste to Jerusalem. I bet they made it in less than 4 months. They went in haste to Jerusalem to the Jews, and they stopped them by force of arms. And now I hope you see a little bit of what Nehemiah is up against. Another timeline. One more. One more for tonight. Before I start showing you that, let me say this. King Artaxerxes of Persia is the one who issued a decree for Ezra to go back to Jerusalem after the temple had been rebuilt and restore proper worship with the priests. He sent with Ezra, he sent all of the people from the temple, all the workers, the priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers. He sent the worship team back to Jerusalem. King Artaxerxes did that. King Artaxerxes is the one who sent Ezra back to restore and rebuild the spiritual lives of the people, the Jews. King Artaxerxes did that. Ezra was sent back, like I said, to build the people of Israel, not only spiritually but socially. They were in distress, they were in disgrace. And we know that the scripture says that that was the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. It was 458 BC when Ezra was sent back. It says it was the 7th year of the King Artaxerxes. So in 458, Artaxerxes, listen to who this man Artaxerxes is. In 458, he sends Ezra back, go restore the people of Israel. A few years later, he sends some other people back, make them stop building that city. So which is it? Split-minded man when it comes to the Jews in Jerusalem. So King Artaxerxes of Persia, same guy, is the one who was pressured into stopping the building of Jerusalem, this what they called a rebellious and evil city, he was also the king that they talked into, they pressured him into stopping the rebuilding of the city, the walls and its gates. Now Nehemiah has heard word of this, that the walls and the gates of Jerusalem are broken down, and he's the only man on earth who can do anything about it. Nehemiah is the only man who has the authority to walk up to the king, and he can do it daily. It's all on the shoulders of Nehemiah. You, Nehemiah, have to take this message into this king who was once for Israel and now is against Israel and its city, Jerusalem. You, Nehemiah, are the one that's going to take the message into the king. Not a good position to be in. Another timeline. Look what's going on here. This is not the same timeline. I've moved these numbers around. 538 BC. Remember what happens? Cyrus the Persian issues a decree that the Jews can return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. 538 BC, 50 or 60 years after 50 years or so after they've been in Babylon, the Persians have taken over from the Babylonians, and the Persian King Cyrus issues a decree that the Jews can now start returning to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. So what happens? Zerubbabel leads 49,000 Jews back into Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. That's Cyrus. Different king. Look at the next line. In 458 BC, what happens? Artaxerxes, King Artaxerxes of Persia, issues a decree for Ezra to return to Jerusalem to rebuild temple worship. I'm sending with you all the utensils, the instruments, all of it. I'm sending you the Levites, the priests, the singers, the gatekeepers. Go back and revitalize worship in Israel. It wasn't enough that the temple was rebuilt. It wasn't being used properly. It was a shambles. The Levites, so many of the Levites were those that had intermarried with the pagans already. After 70 years of being in Babylon, we don't hear a lot about their pagan idolatry, but we clearly see that they're still in love with those non-Jewish women. And the Levites, the priests, are guilty of this. So Ezra is sent back in to fix this. So Artaxerxes issues a decree for Ezra to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild, not a structure, but the souls of these people. So what happens in 458? Ezra returns to Jerusalem to rebuild the people, socially and spiritually. That's his call. That's why he went. He was a priest and a scribe. He went back to learn the law, to obey the law himself, and to teach the law to Israel. That's what one of the famous verses in Ezra is. That I might learn the law, obey it myself, and teach it to your people. That's why he goes back. You go further down the line and you see this event. Artaxerxes is the one who sent Ezra back. But in 446 BC, 12 years go by. People come to Artaxerxes and say, this building of Jerusalem is bad. And so in 446, Artaxerxes issues a decree for rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem to be stopped. That's what I just showed you in Ezra chapter 4. Artaxerxes, the same one that says, Ezra, go back and fix the worship there so that the Jews can pray for me and my sons. That same king, 12 years later, is pressured into saying, stop building this rebellious and evil city. The next thing that shows up on the map in 444 BC, 2 years after Artaxerxes' decree, God steps into the picture. Yahweh takes over. And in 444 BC, this king, this recalcitrant king, this king who said no one will rebuild this city, by God's own grace, this king changes his mind because of the relationship he had with one Jew named Nehemiah. And 2 years after he said, stop it, the same king said, rebuild it, I'll pay for it. Ha. Astounding. God steps in. Artaxerxes issues a decree for the walls of Jerusalem to be rebuilt. And so what occurs in 444 BC? Nehemiah, the great Nehemiah, one of the great leaders in all of this Bible, courageous man. Nehemiah returns as the governor of Judah to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And he did it in absolute record time. What a leader of men this Nehemiah was. But look at that. This is the man that Nehemiah is up against here. The same Artaxerxes that sent Ezra back into the land and said, restore the worship of these people, is the same Artaxerxes who said, wait a minute, this city is evil, we can't do this. Is the same Artaxerxes that said, wait a minute, we've got to rebuild this city. I mean, we're talking about a certain kind of man here. And that's why when you get into the book of Nehemiah, you can understand why it says in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 4, let's just read this verse and we'll stop. When I heard these words, I mean, imagine everything that Nehemiah knew that I've just showed you on these timelines. Nehemiah knows all these things. He knows who he's up against. And in verse 4, when his brother Hanani and his friends tell him about the Jews and Jerusalem, this was Nehemiah's response. I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Because Nehemiah knew Artaxerxes' decree cannot be changed unless Artaxerxes changes it. He said Jerusalem will not be rebuilt until I issue a decree to do it. And here's little Nehemiah that gets to carry the cup into the king, and the great king of Persia, the strongest empire on earth, who alone has the power to make change for God's city, Jerusalem. So you've got one Jew versus one very, very powerful Gentile. And we will see the rest of the story next time we get together. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank